A couple weeks ago, I did a video titled 5 Bad TCG Decks That Were Meta in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, and for the most part, you guys seem to really enjoy that discussion. It sort of talks about some of the differences between Duel Links and the TCG and what makes certain decks better than others when we compare the two formats, and in today's video, I want to expand on that even more and talk about 5 generic cards that didn't really see any play or experimentation in the TCG but were meta in Duel Links. And I do want to mention that there are some cards that won't make it on this list that some people might think would. For example, things like Floodgate Trap Hole, Treacherous Trap Hole, and Enemy Controller are all cards that at some time or another, usually in the past, saw play in the TCG, even if it was just for a format or two, like in the case of Floodgate and Treacherous, or something like Econ that hasn't been played for a while but was very good back in the day. Those cards aren't going to be on this list. I tried really hard to only talk about cards that no one in the TCG probably even knows exist, which is pretty funny considering how powerful they are in Duel Links. We're also not talking about archetype cards in today's video. We're only talking about cards that are generically used, which means that they can be used in a variety of strategies. I am going to mention sort of an honorable mention at the start of this, and that's Paleozoic Canadia. Now, why is this an honorable mention and not actually on the list? Well, it's not actually on the list because in the TCG, this card actually did see some success. However, I thought about putting it on the list because in the TCG, it was not used for any of the reasons that it's used in Duel Links. This card was only used in the TCG in the Frog Paleozoic strategy, and while in Duel Links right now there is a Dinosaur Paleo deck that actually uses other Paleos, in general when people think of Canadia in a Duel Links context, they're thinking of it as a generic back row that a lot of people play, and in the TCG it just never saw play like that. We have other cards that do the same thing or do the same thing but better, so the way that this card has been used in the TCG is very different from the way it's been used in Duel Links. However, because it has seen play in the TCG, even though it's in a very different context, the card isn't going to make it on this list. But I did want to give it an honorable mention because of how different it's used in those two formats. Anyway though, the first card that I want to talk about, well, number 5 on the list, is going to be Massive Morph, which is currently limited on the Duel Links ban list. This is a normal trap card that says target one face-up monster your opponent controls, its attack and defense become double its current attack and defense, but it cannot attack directly. Now this one is especially funny because one of the first things I did before I started playing Duel Links is that I looked at the most recent ban list and this card was on there and I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. But now that I've played Duel Links a lot, I realize how important this card is to be at limited because it's a very degenerate card in a Duel Links format. The main reason this card is so much better in Duel Links, especially when this card got limited, is that extra deck options in Duel Links, even now that 6 Samurai are out there, are pretty limited. In 6 Samurai, you definitely have ways to make level 5 synchros and sometimes level 9 synchros, but other than that, you're pretty much just stuck with making Xian every single turn. In the case of something like Massive Morph, the reason it is so powerful is because it's essentially shutting down one monster from attacking for the rest of the game. This card was also commonly comboed with Lava Golem and Amazoness Swordswoman. Basically, you would Lava Golem your opponent's monsters, as many burn players do, and then on their turn, you would flip Massive Morph, it would prevent it from attacking, and then on your turn, you'd summon Amazoness Swordswoman, crash it into the Lava Golem, and your opponent would lose right there. That's a pretty big combo for Duel Links that there aren't a lot of outs for, especially because there's only 4,000 life points, and it's one of the many reasons that this card ended up getting limited. One of the other reasons this card wasn't played in the TCG is that there are simply more extra deck options for most decks available. Right now in Duel Links, players are going to say things like, oh, but 6 Samurai, they have lots of extra deck monsters they can make, they can synchro into lots of things. Massive Morph isn't as good against 6 Samurais as the other decks out there. However, most decks in Duel Links, especially when this card first came out, really don't have any ways of getting rid of monsters on their field besides tributing them, which many decks just don't even play, which means that when you Massive Morph something, it really does just sort of lock it down forever, unlike in the TCG where this card doesn't really work because there's so many different ways to get your own monsters off the field. At number 4, we have Super Rush Headlong, a quick play spell card that says target one face-up monster you control and declare one attribute. If that target battles an opponent's monster with that attribute this turn, destroy that opponent's monster at the start of the damage step. This card was played in Gladiator Beast, primarily in Duel Links, but also it was played in a variety of other stun strategies. There's been all sorts of stun strategies across Duel Links history, and this card is usually a mainstay in those decks just as a cheap form of removal, because that's basically what this card does. It's sort of like a Sakuradzu armor that you can use aggressively because you can use it when attacking, and overall it's a pretty cool piece of removal in a game that lacks removal, especially when this card was was most popular. However, in the TCG, this card wasn't released very early on in the history of the TCG, which means by the time this card came out, there were all different sorts of removal that were much better than this one. This card came out in 2015 in the TCG, which is about 10 years too late for this card to see any competitive use, although realistically, I'm not even sure if this card would have been played 10 years ago. It's just not that good when you compare it to other removal cards in the TCG. However, because Duel Links lacks a lot of the removal that the TCG has, and also because it's a much more battle-focused game than the TCG, this card becomes a lot more competitive, therefore it's seen tons of play in many different formats across many different decks. At number 3, we have Champions Vigilance, and while this card was not the first card that was limited in Duel Links, it was one of the earliest cards, and also it was the first trap card. This card was admittedly before my time, so I asked you guys on Twitter some of the reasons that this card was so good, but it makes sense, especially when I think of speed dueling, where people are summoning Blue Eyes and setting Champions Vigilance. From what I've gathered from your guys' reactions and comments about this card is that it was mainly played in Blue Eyes and Red Eyes strategies. I am fairly aware that Red Eyes was one of the best decks back in old school Duel Links. I wasn't really playing during that time, but I can understand how this card would be so good. Duel Links is a game that is sort of lacking negation options, especially one as versatile as Champions Vigilance. These days there's obviously Xian in every single game, so that's definitely a new form of negation, but at least at the time that this card came out, I mean, there wasn't really anything else going on to my knowledge. What's funny is that Konami clearly didn't learn their lesson with this card because it was released in the very first starter deck for speed dueling and was one of the things that helped Blue Eyes become a top tier strategy in that game alongside Amazoness, although a very different Amazoness deck than you see in Duel Links or the TCG. And while those first 3 cards might make sense even to Duel Links players that can sort of realize, oh yeah, maybe these wouldn't have been good in the TCG, these next 2, if you have no idea about the TCG at all, are probably just going to blow your mind. And number 2 is going to be Sphere Kerbal. This is a card that if you ask the average TCG player what it did, the chances of them even knowing that this card exists is pretty darn low, just because this card has not only never seen play, but it's also never seen experimentation. It was just kind of a bulk rare that a lot of people admittedly probably just threw away. Sphere Kerbal isn't good in the TCG for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason is that battle hand traps like Sphere Kerbal aren't played anymore. However, it's also worth mentioning that battle hand traps have seen play before Sphere Kerbal came out, and those were much stronger than Sphere Kerbal ever will be. Things like Gores and Trigodia and Battle Fader, these are all cards that saw play in the past when Sphere Kerbal probably wouldn't have seen play even if it was released alongside those cards. This is a card that also was released in 2015, I believe, and by that time people just didn't care about cards like Sphere Kerbal. The ritual part is ironically probably the only reason this card saw any discussion in the TCG, whereas in Duel Links for the most part people aren't even thinking of that effect. I know in some early relinquish builds people did play this card for that reason, but these days people are just playing it as a battle hand trap. Duel Links is a lot more battle focused on the TCG, and this is basically the best way to deal with those sort of attacking monsters without having back row negated by Xian. Therefore this card is very popular even in 2019 Duel Links format, but as far as the TCG goes, yeah, this card is awful. When I first started playing Duel Links competitively 9 months ago, one of the earliest things that someone told me about the format is that Wall of Disruption was one of, if not the best trap card. Now obviously when I looked at things like Treacherous Trap Hole, I could understand how those were good because Treacherous did see play in the TCG, but in the case of Wall of Disruption, I actually thought they were joking because this card is so laughably bad in a TCG context. I just couldn't believe that this card was good in Duel Links. Then I went to like my first couple games in Platinum and I got Wall of Disruption like 5 games in a row, and I realized, oh yeah, this thing is almost impossible to beat in Duel Links, especially 9 months ago before there were nearly as much negation running around. The problem with Wall of Disruption in the TCG isn't very simple. It's a lot of different things. I've actually made an entire video talking about this, but the brief summary is that there's no main phase 2 in Duel Links, and this card definitely is not very good against main phase 2s. There's also not really a lot of extra deck monsters that you can summon in Duel Links, sort of like the same issue with Massive Morph. This is kind of like a mini Massive Morph, or in some ways a wider Massive Morph with less of a restriction, because technically they can still attack, but a lot of times they're at 0 attack, all that sort of stuff. So the main 2 things here is that there's no main phase 2 in Duel Links, and there's you can't really make a lot of extra deck monsters in Duel Links after they get reduced by Wall of Disruption. Oh, and also there's no good mirror forces in Duel Links. You don't have things like Quaking Sneaking Mirror Force, you don't have regular Mirror Force, you don't have Stormy Mirror Force. Thank God, by the way, because those cards probably shouldn't be in Duel Links for a very long time. But overall, I mean, it makes sense that this card is what Konami added, because while it does seem very OP in Duel Links at times, especially back in sort of 9 months ago Duel Links format, these days, I mean, Konami was probably looking when they added cards to Duel Links, well, what's bad in the TCG? What is good enough for Duel Links, or what's not overpowered enough? So this card, because it's so terrible in the TCG, they probably never expected it to be so powerful in Duel Links. One of the ways that this card is sort of broken, quote unquote, in Duel Links is that if you have 3 monsters on the field and you attack into Wall Disruption and all of them go to 0 attack, in many cases you have literally no ways to get those 3 monsters off your board, which means your opponent can simply pass a million times in a row and you'll just deck out. Obviously there's some ways around that. You can do things like enemy control to get rid of your own cards, you can tribute summon, but in a lot of cases some decks out there just don't have an out to getting Wall Disruption for 3 cards. Anyway though, what was the point of this video? Well, the point of this video is that I wanted to show you guys some of the ways that Duel Links in the TCG can be very, very different. A lot of people ask me my opinions on Duel Links when I'm streaming, and for the most part I try to just not answer those questions because it's hard. The formats are very different when you factor in the card pools and the fact that you have 4,000 life points and only 3 monster zones, the fact that there's not like a lot of extra deck monsters, not a lot of extra deck options, the fact that their skills all changed, like how cards are played, how decks are played. These are things that, as someone that doesn't play Duel Links full time, it's really hard for me to sometimes predict which decks will be good and which decks will be bad. This is why in the past I predicted things like Mermills would like break the game, then they ended up being terrible. Now I think I'm a little bit better at predicting that kind of stuff because I've played for a longer time, but overall sometimes I'm still wrong on my analysis just because it's really hard to predict how good a card will be in Duel Links after it was good in the TCG or bad in the TCG, just because I've been proven wrong so many times before. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I have a few more of these planned over the next couple weeks. I want to do one with archetype cards, and also I want to do one that's like the opposite, like 5 good TCG decks that were terrible in Duel Links. I think that'd be funny to look at as well, because in a lot of cases when Konami translates a TCG deck to Duel Links, they remove most of the cards from the archetype. Sometimes they leave the good cards, sometimes they leave the bad cards, sometimes they almost leave all the good cards but not quite enough. It's really interesting to look at some decks that were really powerful in the TCG but then terrible in Duel Links. How does that happen? Maybe we'll find out in a few weeks from now when I make that video. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.